So, today we're talking about a US president, but his real story, the one that truly defines him, it has almost nothing to do with his time in the White House. It's all about what happened after. This is the incredible, unlikely second act of John Quincy Adams, a story that flips the script and begins right where most presidential tales end. I mean, it's a fascinating question, right? Think about it. We almost always judge presidents by what they did during those 4 or 8 years in the Oval Office. But for Adams, man, the real, defining chapter of his entire public life kicked off after a pretty brutal defeat. It was a second act that absolutely nobody saw coming. Okay, so to really get a grip on this incredible comeback, you first have to understand the man himself. John Quincy Adams wasn't just, born into politics. He was literally forged in it. I mean, being the son of John and Abigail Adams, yeah, he was basically groomed for the world stage from the moment he could walk.
And look at this career. This is all before he even gets close to the presidency. At 14 years old, he's already a translator on a diplomatic mission in Russia. Fast forward a bit, and by his late 40s, he's the head negotiator ending the War of 1812. Then, as Secretary of State, he secures Florida for the U.S. I mean, come on, that resume is just screaming future president, right?
And you know the Monroe Doctrine, right? Well, here's a fun fact. While it's named for President James Monroe, the real architect, the brains behind the operation, that was his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. It was totally his vision, a really bold, independent statement that basically told Europe, hey, the Americas are no longer your playground, stay out. And believe it or not, it's still a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy today. All right, so with a background like that, you'd think his presidency would be this amazing, triumphant capstone to an incredible career. Well, not so much. Turns out, his path to the White House was, to put it mildly, an absolute mess. It was tangled up in one of the most controversial elections in all of American history.
So check this out. Is the 1824 election. The results of the popular vote come in, and it looks pretty clear-cut. Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, wins by a lot, a commanding lead over Adams. In our world today, that's it. Story's over. Jackson wins.
But not back then, because in the vote that actually mattered, the Electoral College, Jackson came up short. You had 4 major candidates in the race, and they split the vote so much that nobody, not one of them, hit the magic number for a majority. And oh boy, this is where things get really, really messy. So what happens then? Well, the Constitution says that a deadlocked election like this gets kicked over to the House of Representatives to decide. And who just happened to be the Speaker of the House at the time? None other than Henry Clay. Yep, the same Henry Clay who was one of the candidates who just got knocked out of the race. Now, Clay hated Andrew Jackson, so he used all his power and influence as Speaker to basically hand the presidency to the other guy, John Quincy Adams. You can imagine how Jackson and his supporters felt. They were absolutely furious. And when the first thing President Adams does is nominate Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State, the top cabinet position, they just exploded. They started screaming, "Corrupt bargain." And that accusation, it stuck. It hung over Adams's entire presidency like this giant dark cloud, and it basically robbed him of any real mandate to govern. So yeah, his one term in office was just a constant struggle. He had all these big, ambitious ideas for the country. He called it the American system, building roads, canals, even a national university and observatories. His critics just laughed at him, mocking the observatories as lighthouses of the skies. He was totally isolated politically. So when the 1828 election rolled around, it was no surprise. Andrew Jackson got his revenge, winning in an absolute landslide. And just like that, Adams was out. And this is where the story should end, right? A one-term president, tossed out of office, destined to fade away into a quiet retirement. But for John Quincy Adams, this was actually just the beginning of his most important work ever.
And you can just feel the despair in his own words from his diary. He genuinely believed his career, his entire life's work was completely over. He felt defeated, humiliated, and honestly, he was scared for the country under President Jackson.
Now, I want you to just stop and think about this for a second. A former president of the United States running for a seat in Congress? It was unheard of. No one had ever done it. It was seen as this huge step down, a massive demotion. Even his own family was against it. But when his neighbors back home in Massachusetts asked him to run, he said yes. And with that one decision, he set the stage for one of the most amazing second acts in all of American history.
So he goes back to Washington not as president, but as a lowly congressman. And there he finds this incredible new purpose. He's not bogged down by presidential politics anymore. He's free. And he transforms into the moral conscience of the House, taking on the biggest, most explosive issue of his time, slavery.
See, to try and shut down the growing abolitionist movement, the pro-slavery members of Congress passed something called the Gag Rule. And what it did was just outrageous. It was a direct attack on the First Amendment. It basically said that any petition from any citizen about slavery would just be automatically thrown out, not even read or debated. A total shutdown of free speech.
But they did not count on John Quincy Adams. For 8 long years, day in and day out, he used every single parliamentary trick in the book to fight this rule. He'd stand up and try to read petitions from his constituents, driving his opponents absolutely crazy. They started calling him Old Man Eloquent. And for him, it wasn't just about slavery anymore. It was about the fundamental right of every American to be heard by their government. And finally, after all that fighting, he won. He got the rule repealed in 1844.
But his fight was far from over. In 1841, a massive case with huge international implications landed at the Supreme Court. And the abolitionists knew there was only one person in the country who had the legal chops and the moral authority to argue it.
The stakes here were just immense. On one side, you had a group of Africans from a ship called La Amistad. They had risen up and taken control from their captors. Their argument was simple. We are free people, illegally kidnapped from our homes in Africa, and we have every right to fight for our freedom. But on the other side, you had the U.S. government, which was getting a lot of pressure from Spain, arguing that these people were property, slaves, and that they had to be returned to their owners.
So there he was, a 73-year-old former president, standing before the Supreme Court. He argued for over 8 hours straight. And he didn't just argue legal technicalities, he argued from the very soul of the Declaration of Independence. And he won. The Supreme Court ruled that the Amistad captives were not property. They were free individuals. They were released.
So when you really look back at his whole life, that single troubled term as president, it almost feels like a footnote. His real legacy, the one that matters, was built piece by painful piece right there in the House of Representatives.
Just think about that. 9 terms. For 17 years after being the most powerful man in the country, he got up every day and went to work as a congressman. That is an absolutely incredible testament to his commitment to public service.
And it wasn't just about the fight against slavery either. He was also the key guy behind the founding of the Smithsonian Institution. This random British scientist left a huge sum of money, $500,000 back then, to the U.S. to create an institution for the increase in diffusion of knowledge. Adams made sure that vision became a reality.
And in a way, it's almost poetic how his life ended. It ended right where he had found his true calling. He collapsed from a stroke right there on the floor of the House of Representatives and died 2 days later. And his last words? They just say it all, don't they? A life spent in the arena, always fighting for what he believed in.
Which really leaves us with this one big question. The story of John Quincy Adams kind of forces us to ask what we truly value in a leader. Is it about the high office they hold or the power they wield? Or is it about the fights they choose, the moral courage they show, long after the presidential spotlight has faded away?